Okay, I think we're good to go. Good evening, everyone. I'm Stephen Evans, the Chief Executive of the National Secular Society. Welcome to this, the official launch of Inventing Secularism, the Radical Life of Jacob Holyoake by Ray Argyle. And we're absolutely delighted to have the author joining us all the way from Canada this evening. For me, there can be few other social reformers more deserving of our attention than Holyoke, not only because, like myself, he's a product of the wonderful West Midlands, but because his importance in shaping the modern, more secularized world that we live in has gone unrecognized for too long, I think. So in coining the term secularism, as he did, Holyoke articulated a set of principles and a vision very closely aligned to what we at the National Secular Society campaign for today. And I think we all owe Holyoke a huge debt of gratitude for many of the civil rights and the freedoms that we enjoy today. But clearly the work he pioneered to ensure that people's lives are not restricted or unduly burdened by religion still has a very real relevance today, and the work needs to continue. So if you're not already a member and you support those principles of separation of church and state, freedom of expression, and freedom of and from religion, please do join the National Secular Society. Do become a member, and we'll be sure to put your principles into action. Right, so tonight the event will have a similar format to the book, actually, beginning, as the book does, with a short introduction from one of our directors and NSS historian, Bob Forder. We'll then hear from the author, Ray Argyle himself, who will be in conversation with journalist and NSS podcast host, Emma Park. Ray will then read a short passage from the book, and then it will be over to you for Q&As. So please do get your questions in via the Q&A function box at the bottom of your screen, or if you prefer, you can use the chat function too. So please do feel free to submit any questions you have at any time throughout the evening. I really do recommend you read this book for yourself. We have a discount code that we'll send over to you via an email after the talk, and we'll also pop the code and a link to where you can buy the book into the chat box this evening as well. So do look out for that. Right, that's enough from me. Let's crack on. Thank you for joining us. I hope you do enjoy this evening's event, and I'll now hand you over to Bob Forder.
Good evening, or perhaps if you're in North America, it's good day. I'm delighted to have been asked to set the scene for Ray today. Ray is a journalist by profession who has turned to writing books since retirement, if retirement is the correct term in his case. He has many awards and distinctions to his name, including the Queen Elizabeth II Diamond Jubilee Medal in recognition of, quote, his contributions to Canadian life. And he's written no less than 10 books. I recently read his biography of Charles de Gaulle, entitled The Paris Game, a lively, entertaining narrative which has helped redefine de Gaulle's reputation and reassess his role in the Second World War, very much for the better. I met a rather jet-lagged Ray in September 2019. He was at the start of a research tour of the UK and had booked into a hotel adjacent to Hyde Park. It was a splendid location and it was a glorious stay, though I would suggest he makes better use of TripAdvisor reviews in the future. Nevertheless, it was all worth it, for in Inventing Secularism, Ray has provided us with a much needed and accessible biography of an important 19th century radical's long life. George Jacob Holyoake knew and was influenced by Robert Owen, and in turn he met and was influenced by Richard Carlile. He was one of those who resisted the Stamp Acts, or the taxes on knowledge, if you prefer. He was a Chartist who worked with the cooperative movement pioneers. He knew Charles Bradlaugh. And although they were rivals in many ways, they also worked together from time to time and were bound together through mutual respect. Holyoke was still around and involved when the Rationalist Press Association was founded. To my mind, Inventing Secularism's importance lies less in what it tells us about Holyoke, but more because of what it tells us about the principles, ideas, and causes he represented, and in many cases pioneered. As a journalist, Holyoke not only provides us with a record of working class radical movements over a long lifetime, but acted as a focal point for national radical organisation as the nation evolved during the 19th century, aided by improved communications associated with the development of railways. As a generator and promoter of ideas, his purpose was to improve the quality of life for the masses. It was G.W. Foote, second president of the National Secular Society and one-time colleague of Holyoke's, who said that ideas are more important than votes. Holyoke's legacy is all about that. Secularism is too often misunderstood or underestimated. Holyoke gave us a word and developed an idea which lies at the heart of liberal democracy. Liberal democracy is only partly about free and fair elections. It's just as much about free and equal access to the political system, regardless of race, creed, or religious or non-religious belief, and respect for those beliefs. That is secularism, and that is perhaps the most important, although not the only idea Holyoke developed. That on its own makes this book important, but it becomes even more important when one recognises the threats which confront liberal democracies today. For now, Trump has gone, but complacency is inappropriate. This lively and entertaining book is important as historical biography, but to me, it's just as important for what it teaches us about our world today and the challenges we face. Well done, Ray Argyle. And over to you and Emma Park.
Hi there, everybody.
Hello.
Good evening. Good evening, Ray. Good evening, everybody.
Good evening, Emma.
Just to say, first of all, if you do have any questions as we go along at any point from now on, just put them in the Q&A or in the chat. And after we've done my discussion with Ray and Ray's reading, then we'll have time for hopefully to answer as many of your questions as possible. So Ray, let's just start by talking about the genesis of this book. What made you to decide to write this biography of Holyoke, and why now? Why is it relevant?
Emma, I like that question very much. Before I try to answer it, though, I do want to say thank you to the whole National Secular Society team, Stephen, Bob, Megan, yourself. I appreciate this very much. Great. It's great to be with you. Now, I love that question. Why did I write the book? Yeah, that's a question that I think every author of every book should have to answer. I decided to write Inventing Secularism because of the astonishing and appalling attacks on our democratic and secular rights that we're seeing now. They're coming from religious factions, factions backed by populist and autocratic regimes around the world. So I see this book as a way of defending one of the greatest movements in history, the shift to independent thought, scientific inquiry, and free thought that came with secularism. The way to do that, I decided, was to was to write this book, this first modern biography of the man, George Holyoke, who founded secularism with his invention of the word in 1851. He was a radical social reformer, as Bob has said, and he had a ringside seat, and he played a lead role in every movement of social reform in the 19th century. But he's unknown today to most of the public. So I hope my my book will go some way toward correcting that.
Would you say that his legacy is equally applicable in Canada as well as in the UK and other countries?
His legacy is
in Canada in particular.
Well, in Canada, yes, very much. We're nominally secular. We do, of course, have the Queen as our head of state, and the implication of that. We also, in our Constitution, recognize that Canada is based on the supremacy of God. So there are some sort of titular aspects that don't apply, but nominally we're a very secular country, and in fact we have a controversy in our French-speaking province of Quebec, where a Secularism Act has forbidden the wearing of religious symbols by persons in the public service in positions of authority. And that troubles me a little bit, because as a civil libertarian, I don't like to see individuals have their own personal activities or freedoms curbed. But I think that his legacy runs around the world.
Let's move on to Holyoke's biography and his life as a young man. How did he come to reject conventional Christianity as a young man and to become involved with the radicals and the freethinkers?
Yes, well, it did seem a bit of a conundrum, doesn't it? Because he was raised in a devout Christian home in his hometown of Birmingham. He said his father was a pagan, but his mother had enough religion for both of them. He taught Sunday school in Birmingham, but he recognized the inequalities of Victorian society, of the fact that millions of his fellow Britons were mired in poverty and lacked education and opportunity. And I guess a turning point in his life came early, at the age of 12, when his sister died, after money that they'd saved for her care had to be handed over to the Church of England to meet the Easter tithe. And at that, the rector's office kept George's mother waiting 5 hours before they'd accept their money. And by the time that she got home, the little girl had died. So that kind of turned George into a rebellious young man. And he was attracted to the ideas of Robert Owen, a famous figure in British history, Welsh-born, a capitalist turned socialist, who denounced all religions as frauds. And Holyoke, when Owen set up his Society of Religious Rationalists, Owen became a social missionary. Owen had this utopian vision of establishing worker communities. He managed to set up two, one in New Harmony in the States and the other at Queenwood in England. Both of them failed. But George would have been probably gone through life as a borderline agnostic, except for the imprisonment of his friend, Charles Southwell, who was sent to jail for blasphemy for articles that he wrote in his atheist newspaper, The Oracle of Reason, particularly an article about the Bible that he called, quote, the Jew book, unquote. And he was assailed not for anti-Semitism, but because he had said that the Bible was a monstrous book filled with lust, sodomies, and wholesale slaughterings. And that turned, that treatment, when George saw what was happening, that turned him into an atheist. And he told his flock in Sheffield, where he was the social missionary, he said, I flee the Bible as a viper. I revolt at the touch of a Christian. So that was a pretty outstanding or outspoken position to take. And he decided to go down to Bristol to see Southwell, where Southwell was in prison. And on the way, he's made a speech in Cheltenham. And in answer to a question, did he believe in God? Holyoke said, no, he did not. And that God should be put on half pay, like the retired military. And for that,
and this is enough to put him in, to convict him for blasphemy, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. It was a set-up question by the local minister, and the police nabbed him, and he went into jail for 6 months for blasphemy. He came out convinced that he had to change the English way of life.
Now, you've mentioned, Ray, that it was in 1851 that Holyoke coined the term secularism. So what made him decide to coin this term, which comes from the Latin secularis, so things of this world? And how does his idea of secularism relate to the ideas that were already sort of in the pipeline with the American idea of the separation of church and state and French laïcité?
Those are all good questions, and I deal with them at length in the book Inventing Secularism. But in his when he came out of prison, he went, as in his words, back on the warpath. But it didn't take him long to realize that the word atheism had bad branding, and atheism would not be accepted by the general public because they saw it as representing indecency and immorality. And he realized that a new word was needed. Now, he was familiar with the term secular, which in Dr. Johnson's dictionary, which was the standard reference of that time, describes secular as not holy, worldly. And Holyoke pondered over this, and I would think in a flash of insight, it came to him that this idea of setting up a system of governance to apply the principle of church and state should be called secularism. Now, we have in our time isms left and right, but it was an act, I think, of rare creativity on Holyoke's part to devise the term secularism, because he saw secularism as removing religious dogma from the public sphere, from education, the courts, and law. And in the meantime, that government should keep its hands off religion. That should be a private matter. Now, both America and France have had their problems and are having trouble with secularism. America, because of religious pressures and the strong strain of religiosity that runs in American public life. You know, Thomas Jefferson said that the First Amendment set up an unbreachable wall between church and state, but religious interests have managed to get around that. For example, a new law has just been passed in one state that would permit doctors to refuse to treat patients of whose religion they did not approve. And such anti-secular and inhuman and unfair and improper laws just cannot be allowed to stand. And that is why it's so important that we defend secularism today. France, of course, because of its insistence on integration of the Muslim minority, which I don't think will ever work, rather than adopting the multicultural system that Canada has, for example. France has deep problems, perhaps almost insoluble problems.
So we have this idea of having this sort of balance somewhere along the line between complete secularism that we find, say, in France, and a sort of secularism which verges on not being secularism that we find in the US. And then Britain is a sort of third way. There, of course, we don't have secularism in our constitution as yet. Despite moving on to the National Secular Society, which sort of came out of this secularist movement. Now, although Holyoke coined secularism, the man who actually founded the National Secular Society in 1866 was Charles Bradlaugh, who was Holyoke's younger and more charismatic rival. Ray, how did the relationship between Holyoke and Bradlaugh develop during the course of their lives? Of course, Bradlaugh died in 1891, actually before Holyoke, despite being the younger man. And what impact did this relationship, this sort of dynamic opposition, in a way, have on the development of secularism in Britain in the 19th century?
Well, I think that the relationship of the Holyoke versus Bradlaugh, I think it makes for one of the most contentious chapters of their lives. Now, Bradlaugh was younger, more vigorous, and as you say, more charismatic than Holyoke. He was also a better organizer. Holyoke's efforts to organize a secular society went nowhere because he got distracted by other issues, particularly his interest in the cooperative movement. Ironically, Holyoke had introduced Bradlaugh the first time Bradlaugh, when I think he was only about 17 years old, spoke at a public meeting of free thought, and that was their connection ever since. The two tried working together particularly on Bradlaugh's newspaper, the National Reformer, which was a successor to Holyoke's own paper, The Reasoner. But disagreement was inevitable. Bradlaugh's insistence on atheism as being fundamental to secularism clashed with Holyoke's view that secularism should be a broad, mainstream public channel, and that it should accept people of faith as long as they're willing to leave their religion in their church and in their home and let the public sphere be free of religious control.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit more, Ray, because this is in a way at the heart of the difference between Bradlaugh and Holyoke, and also at the heart of how one defines what secularism is. So famously, in 1870, Holyoke and Bradlaugh held a two-night debate in which they argued over precisely this point, whether secularism should or necessarily did involve this commitment to atheism, and whether it was really possible to support secularism without being a religious skeptic. Now, Bradlaugh, of course, took the hardline militant view, perhaps a bit like a 19th century version of Richard Dawkins, that secularism should and did imply atheism. But Holyoke, as you say, took a sort of more moderate view that he wanted secularism to be something that could involve religious people as well, as long as they left their religion behind in a way, or in the church. Now, Holyoke, of course, had been imprisoned for blasphemy as a young man. How far did his attitude towards religion soften in later years? And I mean, why was he so insistent on this idea that religious people ought to be included in his idea of secularism?
You've posed a whole series of questions there, and I'll do my best to try and follow through on them. It would have been quite a sight to see these two men going at it in their debates over the 2 evenings that they met each other. I don't think either man conceded much to the other in their core beliefs. Bradlaugh argued, for example, that he saw no difference between finding that God is impossible to find and being an atheist. And Holyoke attacked Bradlaugh for what he saw as weakening of secularism. He pointed to the poverty of resources, in his words, that were available at the National Secular Society. And Holyoke thought it important to keep clear of atheism. It was the first duty of secularists, he said, to stay away from atheism. Both men tried, as the time went on, to bridge the gap between their ideas and their personalities. Bradlaugh offered Holyoke the post of vice president of the Secular Society, but Holyoke turned him down. Although 6 years later on, I guess when their views had been tempered a little bit more, he did accept, but he was never active in that. And when Bradlaugh died in 1891, Holyoke gave him a fulsome eulogy. I'm going to quote from what he said. He said that Bradlaugh was the most illustrious fighting propagandist that England had ever seen. And it was interesting, a number of Christian ministers attended Bradlaugh's funeral, along with, I found of great interest, a man, I think he was 19 or 20 years old, Mahatma Gandhi, who would make a certain mark for himself in India. But Holyoke, although he was very much opposed to the principles and ideas of Christianity, was always took pains to be very polite to his Christian opponents. He was interested in what they had to say, and when he went on tour, he always went, if he was in some provincial town on a Sunday, he always found a church where he went to hear the minister, and did likewise when he visited and toured the United States and Canada. He sought out Christian ministers and churches. So he kept an open mind. I don't think he ever veered away from his core atheism or agnosticism, to use the term that Thomas Huxley devised. But he presented himself in a non-threatening way. And I think that was a vital part of the growing acceptance for secularism in England.
Yeah, let's talk then about something relevant to this, which is Holyoke's character. Because I mean, I wonder, Bradlaugh was always a very divisive character, of course, and then, you know, it was either him or nothing. Do you think Holyoke's attitude towards including religious people in secularism, if possible, was reflected in his character? What sort of a character did he have?
Well, I think he was a little shy, a little withdrawn. He was socially conservative in his personal lifestyle, and in fact, another issue that separated he and Charles Bradlaugh was birth control. And when Bradlaugh and Annie Besant published this book on birth control, Holyoke advised against that. So Holyoke had his flaws, as we all do, but you know, he didn't abuse his staff or cheat his investors or beat his wife. He was a caring father, a considerate husband, but a man of the Victorian age. He never asked his wife's religious views, but in his memoirs, he points out that he never hesitated to present his own. He had a good sense of humor. He was a satirist. He made light of his circumstances wherever he might find himself, whether it was in a flea-infested prison cell or a bed bug-ridden room in a cheap hotel. He found ways to joke about that. But he was a realist. Holyoke saw the world as it was, and he set out to change it. His chief flaw was his failure to focus. He admitted that he tried to crowd too many ideas into his speeches. He took up every social cause going. He backed European revolutionaries. He even went out into the countryside and tested some bombs for them. He backed open Sundays. He fought the stamp tax on newspapers, a tax that was imposed so that it increased the price of papers to the point where working class people couldn't afford to buy them and therefore couldn't afford to get educated. And
he got involved in many different causes of his time.
What he was in, the count is that he was a member of 22 committees and of different organizations. And it was said that if a cause didn't have an organization, he'd started one. So, and he wrote about 160 pamphlets and books. Through it all, he struggled with ill health, blindness, all the result, I think, of malnutrition and lack of medical attention. But he was not afraid of death. He wrote that he who knows how to live will know how to die.
And that's perhaps one of the most difficult things in a way for atheists or non-religious people is this, from the religious perspective, the attitude to death if you don't believe in an afterlife.
Well, it goes back, I think, to what we heard from Epicurus, that after there's nothing to fear in death because after death there's nothing.
Exactly. In terms of
but he lived, I must say, George Holyoke lived to the grand old age of 88, despite all his health problems. And when he died, he was hailed as one of the grand old men of Britain.
Finally, moving on for my final question, Ray, before we go into your reading, looking ahead after Holyoke's death, in terms of his legacy in Britain in particular, how far would you say that secularism in Britain today is still indebted to Holyoke's ideas?
I think it's safe to say that the average Briton is today a secularist. More than half of the population identifies itself as having no religion. Only 12% of the people are affiliated with the Church of England. That's down from, I think the figure was 40% in 1983. So most of the old barriers against free thought have fallen in higher education, the professions, politics, business. Holyoke was a Republican, but he never made much noise or campaigned against the monarchy. But as we all know, the trappings of a pre-secular society remain in the UK today. The monarchy, the Queen's role as head of both head of state and head of the church and defender, and with the Anglican bishops sitting in the House of Lords, and education, religious education still having a role in the schools. And I must say the National Secular Society has an important role that it plays in public education and parliamentary lobbying. As a Canadian and a subject of the Queen, I want to say that I believe it's time that we rethought the whole idea of monarchy. But finally, Emma, I'd like to say something about George Holyoke's vision of the future. He looked beyond his own time. He was confident, in his words, that secular principles involved for mankind a future. And it would be, as he wrote, and I'm going to read from his words, it would offer an infinite diversity of intellect with equality among humanity, all things, noble society, the treasures of art, and the riches of the world to be had in common. His vision, I think, rings more true today than ever, considering the way we're waging war on nature and plundering the environment. We need to do better, and the legacy of George Holyoke encourages, I think, to do so.
Ray, thank you very much. That's great. I think what we'll do is we'll have your reading now, and then after that we'll have Q&A from the audience. All
right, I'm very happy to do that. I'm going to read just a short section of from the book, chapter 11, how the idea of secularism came into being. When George Jacob Holyoke devised the word secularism in 1851, he gave name to a movement that would affect the life experience of millions around the world. Holyoke's secularism was founded on the idea that the duties of a life lived on earth should rank above preparation for an imagined life after death. Public morality, compassion, altruism, social enlightenment need not depend on religious foundations. This idea, as old as the democracies of the Greek city-states and as new as the radical theories of the free thinkers, would seep slowly into Britain's national life, changing forever the country's social and political landscape. Freed of religious impediments, blocking entry of the irreligious to higher education, the professions, and positions of influence in public life, people could get on with the business of improving their lives. Where theology regarded life as a sinful necessity, secularism saw life as a cause for rejoicing. It led George Holyoke to set out a new purpose for living. As he wrote, leave religious dreamers to wait on supernatural aid. Let us look to what man can do for man. Let pulpits rave, and if such unhappily is still their wont, bigots scold in their erring zeal. But let no man fear to serve humanity. The end of that man will be peace. He who knows how to live will know how to die. While Holyoke saw secularism as an alternative to Christianity, he realized it would never sweep away all the remnants of a Christian age. The two could coexist, with religion remaining a freely chosen option for private life, but the state, education, science, government, the economy, devoid of religious dictates. George Holyoke found himself leading multiple lives, any one of which would have challenged a less determined person. He was the exponent of the new concept of secularism, the editor of a newspaper of anti-religious views, a sympathizer and supporter of political refugees exiled from their homelands, an author of political pamphlets and political tracts, and a husband and a father of 4 children with whom he spent very little time. Whatever his task of the moment, one issue would have shifted in and out of his thoughts: how to organize society so as to improve the material welfare of humanity and give everyone the right to live their lives without religious interference. He no longer held to the robust atheism of his youth, and he had no wish to impose on the religious views of others. Holyoke wanted everyone, not only himself, but everyone, to be subject to just rule and to see it as their duty to apply a portion of their time and energy to the service of others. Holyoke reflected on the combat that was raging between the churches and advocates of free thought when he became a social missionary. Magistrates raised in the dogma of religion sent people to jail because of their opinions. The combat, he knew, had been going on for centuries, and any independent, uncontrolled opinion had always been regarded as dangerous. Holyoke would sum up all that had gone before. When the priest as master inquiry is sharply reduced, he believed it was time to end the mastery of priests. While monitoring the reverses suffered by the revolutionaries of 1848, he was pondering the principles that would become basic to secularism. There's no record of how or when George Holyoke struck on the word secularism as the defining expression of public life, free of religion. He must have discussed the idea with his good friend and mentor, William H. Ashurst, and a newfound ally, the author, George Henry Lewes. One can picture it. Holyoke up late in his rooms in Tavistock Square, London, stabbing with his pen at the sheet of paper in front of him, at his desk for hours on this midsummer night. He searches for the word to describe a single transfixing idea, one that would hasten the day when the public would enjoy a society shorn of religious regulation over every aspect of life. His table cluttered with Latin texts, French volumes, and London newspapers, Holyoke reaches for Dr. Samuel Johnson's dictionary, still the final authority on Her Majesty's English. He finds secular, not spiritual, relating to affairs of the present world, not holy, worldly. With a flash of insight and a scratch of his pen, Holyoke creates a new English noun, secularism. In December came the declaration that would bring the new word socialism into secularism into public view. It appeared almost as an afterthought in an announcement in his newspaper, The Reasoner, of a series of free discussion festivals at the Hall of Science in City Road. They called their meeting halls the Hall of Science. And it read, Mr. G.J. Holyoke, editor of The Reasoner, will lay before the meeting on the 29th a statement of the present position of secularism in the provinces. It was a tea party as well as an evening of speeches. Tea was served at 6:30. Austin Holyoke's wife played the piano and sang Praise to the Martyrs. Holyoke repeated much of an earlier talk on Christianity. He was careful to distinguish between thoughtful freethinkers and the dissolute and ignorant classes. To make himself clear, he added, free thinkers who do think should be distinguished from those who do not think. And this can be done only by announcing a principle, defining aims, and creating an organization to attain those aims. Its chief principle should be to uphold the recognition of the secular sphere as the province of man. He invited his audience to join a newly formed secular society. It would have an air of exclusivity. We do not need everybody to join in this work. A selection of earnest men will suffice for us. The lesson of secularism, Holyoke reaffirmed, is that all man's work and devotion ought to be directed towards the things of this world and towards humanity. So I think that short section perhaps sets out some of the character of Holyoke and the principles that he established for secularism.
Thank you very much, Ray. That's some fascinating little excerpt from your book. Let's move on to the Q&A now from the audience. So we've got a fair number of questions. Maybe we'll start with a question by David Warden. Now he says that Holyoke's principles of secularism seem to have a lot in common with what we now call humanism. This is a very interesting point, actually, because you might say in a way that actually Bradlaugh was perhaps closer to humanism and Holyoke was close to the position adopted by the National Secular Society, and that Holyoke would have allowed religious people to be part of his secular state, whereas perhaps humanism, the humanists are more sort of towards a more pro-atheist view, possibly. What do you think, Ray? Where do Holyoke's principles of secularism stand in relation to modern humanism? Did they have an influence on the development of humanism from the foundation of the Union of Ethical Societies in 1896?
Well, they're first cousins, of course. Secularists are humanists, and humanists are secularists. And the term, of course, humanism, goes back to the study of the humanities that originated in the 12th and 13th centuries, but it's only in recent years that the term humanism has come to be applied to embrace secular concepts. So I think the two go hand in hand, and one is essential to the other.
Thank you, Ray. We've now got a question from Owen Carter. So Owen is talking about Holyoke's early involvement with Owenism and his long-term interest in the cooperative movement. where, says Owen, do you think these organizations that nurture agitators for freedom of conscience, where might they be found today? Organizations that are critical of laissez-faire capitalism. Do you think that secularism today has become too decoupled from critiques of capitalism? Should secularism be perhaps more political, more pro, more anti-capitalism, more pro cooperative?
Well, I challenge the premise of the question. I think that secularism is tied in very close to anti-capitalism. Secularism rests on liberal democracy, on the accessibility of the vote, of the right to express opinions, and certainly Holyoke's vision of the sharing of all the good things of humanity must stand as one of the early anti-capitalistic statements. An interesting thing, I think, is that when Holyoke started his newspaper, The Reasoner, he announced that it was opposed to religion, supportive of a communist point of view. But I hasten to add, it was a pre-Marxian type of communism that Holyoke advocated, not revolution. He wanted better wages for the workers, a better deal for the average person. So today we face the challenge of maintaining a secularist society in which everyone has access to the vote. There are movements in the United States, activities in the state legislatures to suppress the vote, to make it more difficult to vote. That has to be rejected. And clearly the new economic requirements falling out of the worst health crisis of our lives, falling out of the COVID pandemic, demand that there be a common public interest in economic issues, and that there be a better sharing, that no longer can we permit the 1% to gobble up 80% of our wealth.
Thank you, Ray. Lawrence Smyer, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, says, were there any significant women working with Holyoke?
There were indeed many active women in the secularist movement, and I credit a good number of them and write about a number of them in the book. Annie Besant, who left her church minister husband to come to London and attend Charles Bradlaugh's meetings, later becoming a very close confidant. The famous free thinker Richard Carlile, his wife was very active in the secularist movement. Harriet Martineau, who is thought of as the first woman sociologist and wrote many books, was a very strong supporter of Holyoke and secularism. George Eliot, the Marian Evans, her real name, and her books are now being republished under her name, was an active secularist. So there was a very strong movement, and Holyoke was very much an advocate of women's rights. He urged women to start their own publications and to campaign for their own privileges, and very much supported the extension of the vote to women.
Although he stopped at the dissemination of contraceptive advice.
Hmm. I'm
What do you
sorry,
say?
on that
You
point.
know, in the pamphlet which Charles Bradlaugh and Danny Besant
Oh, yes.
published on
Yes,
birth control,
well,
Holyoke was still opposed to that.
yes, he was opposed to that. Because, as I said earlier, he was a social conservative in that regard. And he told Annie Besant that she should not go ahead with this publication because it would ruin her reputation as a lady.
and in fact, it did have a bad effect on her because it meant that she was not able to she lost custody of her children. So yeah.
Right.
Now, another question from Moray Rumney. How much of Holyoke's objection to religion, and in particular to Christianity, was based on the particular failings of the church, rather than on disagreement with the essential tenets of Christianity itself?
That is a question that I think we all need to ponder. Is our concern about religious influence the result of misappropriation, mismanagement, mishandling of worldly affairs by people in the church, or is there the fundamental flaw, the belief that there is a hereafter, that we have souls, that there is a God who surveys over all of us. One of the interesting things that Holyoke did when he was in jail, he was given a book by a Dr. William Paley called Natural Theology, in which Paley gave the example of a watch as something that had to be designed and created by a superior being. And his theory was, it came to be the watchmaker's theory, that just as a watch has to have a master who made it, so this complex universe must have a master who made it. But Holyoke responded to that with a pamphlet disagreeing with those views, and pointing out that, well, the watchmaker had a father, and therefore God must have had a father. So where does that take us? So though that was an interesting contest along that line. But I think Holyoke's view, as of course Bradlaugh's view also, was that fundamentally there is no hereafter, that we do not have souls, that our morality will be determined is based on our attitude and our treatment of our fellow human beings.
And of course, fundamentally, the point of secularism was that it was primarily about focusing on this life, and just the afterlife is irrelevant one way or another.
Exactly, an imagined life that we don't know whether it exists or not.
A question from Mark O'Connor. Do you think, how much did Holyoke and Bradlaugh know about Islam or about other non-Christian religions? And do you think, had they been exposed to other religions, that this exposure might have changed or maybe hardened Holyoke's commitment to atheism?
Well, I think that as Euro-centered white males, they didn't pay a lot of attention to the faiths of other worlds, of other parts of the world, of Hinduism, Buddhism, and so on, or Judaism for that matter. But I do think it's interesting to observe that that Holyoke felt very strongly that all points of view on all faiths should be free to express themselves, providing they do not try to interfere with laws and legislation that affects other people.
And that's the dividing line. Yeah,
that's the dividing line, the line in the sand.
From Christopher Moore, Ray, talking about your own views, are you a secularist born and bred, or did you have your own moment of discovery, your own moment of enlightenment about secularism?
I'm sorry, would you restate that? I didn't quite understand that.
Are you a secularist from the beginning, or did you have a particular moment when you discovered secularism and realized you're a secularist?
Well, when I was a schoolboy, I was used to saying the Lord's Prayer every day, and I thought nothing of that. And until one Friday afternoon, I was home alone after school, and two people knocked on the door, and they were emissaries of the Jehovah's Witnesses. And they preached at me a little bit, and I listened to that, and they had an engrossing story to tell of the wonders of Jesus. And so they left some literature with me, and I must say I was quite taken up with it, and I spent the whole weekend reading it all. And Monday went back to school and hurried home from school, anxious to get back to my religious reading. I had pretty well become a believer. And so I sat down again, and I don't know, maybe it was the 5 or 6 hours of a secular boyhood that I'd spent, or maybe it was an innate skepticism about what my elders were telling me. But I was reading this literature, and suddenly it occurred to me, none of this makes sense. It's just all nonsense. And so from that point on, I was a skeptic. I asked my dad if he believed in God, and he said, well, not as such, but I do think there's a higher power there. And so I went along with that for a while. But as I studied religions and learned about secularism, over a period of years, my thoughts, ideas hardened, and I finally recognized that I was an atheist, and quite happy to do so.
So it's a long process. But
a long process, yes.
Yeah. From Guy Douglas, what was Holyoke's attitude to slavery? And what was his attitude to other races or other nations, other peoples?
He doesn't say a lot in his material, but clearly he was opposed to slavery. He spoke out against it. And when he went to the United States, he visited such people as the first Negro, as the term of that era, the first Negro who was appointed, I'm not sure of the title, in Washington to a very senior position, visited with Ralph Ingersoll, the great American agnostic and opponent of slavery. So he was clearly an opponent of slavery, and expressed his views on that in many times and in many ways.
And that, I mean, presumably he would have agreed with Charles Bradlaugh, who was very much, I mean, I don't know, do you think he would have done, Charles Bradlaugh was very much in favor of the equality of all races and all nations, and in favor of Indian self-determination. Do you think Holyoke would have agreed with that?
I think so. I think that his attitude was that we are all each equal individuals, and we all must respect each other.
From David Pollock, which of Holyoke's writings would you recommend for reading today?
That's a tough question, because Holyoke's writings exemplify the formality, the long verbosity, long-windedness, I was going to say, of Victorian writing. It's difficult. His work most of his work is difficult to read for that reason. But probably the best book I would recommend is his Principles of Secularism, in which he sets out in pretty basic and pretty elemental terms his approach to the subject.
Question from Simon Bly. Now, you mentioned before that one of the reasons that motivated you to write this book was the challenges faced by secularism around the world. And Simon asks, when you consider what is happening in countries like Turkey, which is in theory secular, and France and the USA, do you worry about the threats which secularism is facing at the moment?
Well, very much. I have an epilogue in my book, which I've entitled Secularism Under Siege, because we are under siege all around the world. The United States certainly still, despite the election of a progressive president, across Europe, Poland, Hungary, have autocratic regimes. Turkey, along the most secular of Islamic countries, has reversed course. For example, the famous Hagia Sophia, which was a secular museum since 1936, has just been changed and reinstituted as a mosque. And in India, the Modi government there is attacking its Muslim minority with a brand of Hindu nationalism. China, despite its constitution, in which it says no one shall be obliged to follow any particular religion, and no one can impose religious views on another, nonetheless doesn't hesitate to oppress its Muslim minority. So secularism, which is such a valued gift to all of us, which gives us our liberal democracy, our equal rights, is very much under siege, and we must stridently speak out in defense at every assault, at every attack that we see on this great institution. Now, I wonder if that brings the questions to a close, or do we have any further, Emma?
I think we temporarily lost Emma for a moment.
We had another very interesting question, which I was just looking at from, also from Owen Carter. Now, Owen talks about the fact that there are a couple of traditions running through 19th century religion, which the one is the classicizing one, which goes back to Epicurus and Lucretius and the atomists. And so that's a sort of philosophical tradition of non-religion, if you like. The other, from sort of the Thomas Paine tradition, it says that you don't need any sort of learned knowledge, you just need your own wit to see that religion is foolish. You don't need to any sort of abstract thought. What was Holyoke's view? How did he come to sort of have this view about the non-existence of God? Was it from a sort of philosophical abstract reasoning process, or was it from a more sort of direct Paineite stance? And yeah, where does that put us now? Which is the better approach, the more sort of philosophical abstract classicizing approach to non-religion, or the more practical Paineite one?
I think George Holyoke was a practical man. I think he approached his views on the basis of the condition of human life as he saw it around him. As he said, 18 centuries when he was on trial, and he spoke for nine hours in his own defense in court, giving one of the great non-legal speeches in English court history. He said, after 18 centuries of Christianity, where are we? Starvation, disease, ignorance, malnutrition. I think he took a practical approach, saw that religion was not delivering in this life what we needed and what we had a right to, because the wealth is there all around us. And therefore, let's focus on that, set aside this imaginary life. There may or may not be an afterlife. We don't know that. We do know we have this life that we live here today. The church has not served us to improve our living conditions in any notable way. We need to find a better way of doing that.
So yeah, but fundamentally practical, pragmatic view. Yeah.
Practical, pragmatic sums it up very well.
Question from Rosemary. What did Holyoke think about Darwin and the theory of evolution? Of course, Darwin's Origin of the Species was published in 1859. So Holyoke, I guess, would have been what, in his 30s, 40s, something like that. Yeah. So did he have, what were his views about Darwin?
I think Holyoke, in a non-scientific way, predated Darwin because he wrote of the progression of mankind from the lower orders. He wrote of that when he created his pamphlet answering Dr. Paley on the watchmaker's theory. So Holyoke was very much in accord with the theories that Darwin provided a scientific basis for. So Holyoke would have had no trouble with anything that Charles Darwin had written.
And just on that subject, actually, I mean, it occurs to me, of course, Bradlaugh, taking them together, was very much always working class, and he was slightly ostracized by Darwin and Huxley, who were more gentlemen. And where did Holyoke fit into all this? Was he more on the working class side, or more trying to socially upwardly mobile?
Yes, well, Holyoke came from a working class family, although he had a childhood much more comfortable than most English children of that period. But I do think that as Holyoke grew older, that he looked around and, as I mentioned earlier, saw the condition of life and saw that it was unacceptable and intolerable and had to change.
From Barry Francis, what do you see as the greatest threat to secularism today?
As the greatest
threat?
The greatest threat. Indifference. Lack of education about public life and about our history. We're not doing a good job in our schools of teaching history, I don't think, in any country. And particularly speaking of Canada and the United States, and now increasingly in Europe with new arrivals from other parts of the world, we need to instill in our young people an appreciation of where we started, how we got to where we are today, and what we have to do to protect and improve our society.
Mm. And in fact, it's quite interesting that the people like Holyoke and Bradlaugh just aren't really taught much in English history, as far as I can tell.
No, as I say, Holyoke, although the specialists and the historians are well acquainted with his life, is unknown to the general public, and probably Charles Bradlaugh is not too much better known either. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that my book, Inventing Secularism, The Radical Life of George Jacob Holyoke, will help to correct that.
A question from Jamal Saeed. What is the relationship between pluralism and secularism? And do you discuss this in your book?
I'm sorry, between?
Pluralism and secularism.
Pluralism and secularism. Jamal, thank you for that question, and thank you for tuning in today. I view the pluralistic society as the ideal mode of secular governance. So I think that they're a little bit like secularism and humanism. I think they go hand in hand. Certainly, secularism has a broad, wide mainstream for all of us to work and live and play and enjoy together. And I wanted to say earlier, we ran out of the question. I wanted to say that, the big difference is that fundamental Christianity sees life as a pain. Secularism sees life as a joy.
Absolutely. It's a question of whether your focus is on this world or the next world.
Indeed.
A question raised by several people in different ways is about this issue of atheism. So do you think that cultures which are not sort of secular are just anti-atheist? I mean, Holyoke was concerned even in the 19th century that atheism had this negative brand. And indeed, when he has this debate with Charles Bradlaugh, he mentions the fact that he consulted, I believe, Cardinal Newman's brother about this. And Newman said that atheism had been associated with immorality since the days of the ancient Greeks. Do you think that today still atheism has this these negative connotations in cultures around the world?
I think the edges have been smoothed. I think the ill feeling is no longer against atheism as it was at one time. I think there's a certain respectability that has been gained by atheism. It's interesting, as a student of history, I've been reading recently about the adoption of Christianity by the Romans in the 4th century by Emperor Constantine, and the consequences of that, how all of the learnings of the ancient Greeks were thrown aside, and I'm firmly of the view that the advent of Christianity probably has set us back scientifically 1,000 years. 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, from the adoption of Christianity in Rome to the emergence of the Renaissance, we were mired in ignorance, in superstition, in ridiculous beliefs and myths. And if we had spent that time on scientific inquiry, on education, where would we be today?
Yeah, of course, yeah, there are also, I mean, people speaking on advocates of Christianity would say that, of course, Christianity did have lots of positive effects as well. So I suppose one has to weigh the different things in the balance. But that's certainly a very big topic, which would be deserving of a lot more debate. Just looking at what other questions do we have? When did you yourself, this is from Nathan Alexander, when did you yourself first come across Holyoke?
I came across Holyoke in my reading of English history not too long ago, about 10 years ago. So again, I'm, with most people, unless you begin to delve into these things, you don't know about this individual and about the transformative effect that he had on society.
Ray, I think that's all we've got time for now, but thank you very much again for your fascinating talk and introducing us to your really interesting book, and I do recommend it to everybody. Just to say also, thank you, first of all, to Ray so much for taking the time to speak to us all the way from Canada. Thank you also to Bob Forder, historian at the National Secular Society, for the introduction. Thank you to everyone at the NSS, particularly to Megan Manson for organising this event behind the scenes, and to Stephen Evans, the CEO. Thank you also to Conway Hall for hosting us, which has been really great to have this opportunity to have Ray give his talk, and to Jeff Davey for the technical support. And finally, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. We hope that you've enjoyed this seminar. I'll be back with episode 48 of the National Secular Society podcast next Tuesday, which will be on Jehovah's Witnesses. We hope to see you again for future events. Thank you all very much and have a great evening.
And I'd just like to add to Emma's thanks to all of you, especially those who tuned in today to listen to us. Thank you all. It's been wonderful and a great experience.